They were just 7 young men when they boarded the B-24 Stardust Eagle that morning, brothers in arms bound by courage, duty, and the unknown. Captain James "Jim" Mallory, 26, was their leader, a farm boy from Kansas, whose steady hands on the yoke had saved them more than once. Beside him in the co-pilot's seat sat Lieutenant Frank Dawson, calm and calculating, the type of man who could do trigonometry in his head while flak tore through the sky. Behind them, Navigator Charles Ito, a quiet Californian with a knack for celestial charts, pored over maps he'd memorized by heart. Flight engineer and mechanic Sergeant Paul Rizzo, 22, kept the engines humming, a Brooklyn kid with grease under his nails and jokes that kept the crew sane. Radio operator Corporal William "Billy" Harris handled the constant chatter from base, his headphones glued to his ears. The gunners, Staff Sergeants Eddie Larkin and Henry Cho, were the youngest, barely 20, but deadly accurate and fiercely loyal. Together, they had flown 12 successful missions. This one would be their 13th. It was July 18, 1944, 0430 hours, on a humid island airstrip in the Solomon Chain. The Stardust Eagle rumbled down the coral runway under a moonless sky, heavy with fuel and explosives. Their orders? A reconnaissance run over a string of Japanese supply convoys suspected of supplying Guadalcanal. They were to photograph enemy positions, report back coordinates, and, if possible, cripple a transport on their return flight. Routine, they were told. But every man on that bomber knew nothing over the Pacific was routine. The Pacific was a monster, vast, unpredictable, unforgiving. At 20,000 feet, storms could swallow an aircraft whole. A faulty engine could mean hours adrift in shark-infested waters. And somewhere out there, enemy Zero fighters prowled like wolves, waiting for the faint silhouette of a bomber to appear against the clouds. But none of that stopped them. As dawn broke behind them, the Stardust Eagle climbed into the orange-streaked sky, its engines roaring over the endless blue. It was supposed to be a simple mission. It would become a mystery that haunted historians for generations, because within hours, the crew of the Stardust Eagle would vanish without a trace. By mid-morning, the Stardust Eagle was a silver speck against an endless canvas of blue, the Pacific stretching beneath them like an alien world. Flying over land offered reference points, rivers, mountains, cities. Out here there was only water, horizon, and the haunting illusion of stillness. Beneath those waves lay miles of nothing, a cold abyss that could swallow an aircraft whole and never give it back. Weather in this part of the Pacific was a living, breathing enemy. Towering thunderheads rising like cathedrals, sudden squalls that turned daylight into darkness. The bomber's 4 Pratt and Whitney engines thundered on, but every man aboard knew they were flying on borrowed luck. One mechanical failure, one miscalculation of fuel, and they'd have no runway, no parachutes, no hope. At 0945 hours, Harris logged a routine transmission to base. Stardust Eagle, position grid 14-7, all systems normal. It would be the last calm message they ever sent. At 10:30, static crackled through the headset. Fragments of a report, cloud formation ahead, altering course, visibility dropping, then silence. No mayday, no distress call, just dead air. The crew pressed on into the storm. Sheets of rain hammered the fuselage. Lightning forked across the sky. Navigator Ito squinted at his maps, recalculating position as the magnetic compass swung wildly. Dawson fought the controls, hands slick with sweat, while Mallory's voice stayed steady, even as visibility dropped to 0. "Hold her steady." "We're through this soon," but they never emerged. Somewhere beyond that wall of weather, the Stardust Eagle disappeared, swallowed by the very ocean they had flown over dozens of times before. Back at base, minutes stretched into hours. Calls went unanswered. Radar showed nothing. Search planes combed the sea for debris, oil slicks, anything. They found only empty water and endless silence. The official report would later call it lost due to weather conditions, but for decades veterans, historians, and families would whisper darker theories: sabotage, mechanical failure, even capture. Whatever the truth, one fact was undeniable. On that morning in 1944, 7 men and 1 bomber simply vanished into the Pacific, leaving behind nothing but questions and a silence that would last for 75 years. At 1800 hours, the Stardust Eagle was due to check in over their final waypoint, a grid sector west of Bougainville. They never did. By 1830, base communications had grown tense. Harris's last transmission, logged at 10:47 hours, had been routine. Heavy turbulence, adjusting course, all systems stable. Then nothing. No signal, no emergency beacon, no SOS. Silence. At first, it wasn't unusual. Pacific storms were notorious for scrambling radios and throwing navigational instruments into chaos. But as the hours dragged on, even the most seasoned commanders began to feel a cold weight settle in their stomachs. Mallory's crew was one of the best. They knew how to handle rough skies. For them to miss a scheduled check-in was unthinkable. By midnight, the situation shifted from delayed to missing. Command staff crowded around plotting tables, tracing the bomber's last known trajectory with grease pencils, debating possibilities: mechanical failure, fuel starvation, and emergency ditching at sea. The Pacific had claimed hundreds of aircraft already, its watery grave swallowing both planes and men without a whisper. But this was different. The Stardust Eagle hadn't just vanished off radar, it had vanished from reality. Official messages went out across naval and air commands. B-24 missing in action. Last contact grid 14-7. Search to commence at first light. On the surface, the tone was clinical, detached, the language of wartime bureaucracy, but underneath there was disbelief. In the ready rooms, pilots stared quietly at the empty space where Mallory's crew usually stood during briefings. Mechanics left a mug of coffee untouched on Rizzo's workbench. Even the hardened intelligence officers, men used to loss on a daily scale, traded glances that betrayed their unease. By dawn, the grim truth was undeniable. The Stardust Eagle was gone. No debris field, no oil slick, no parachutes, just the empty Pacific and a single log transmission, routine, almost boring, from a crew that had simply ceased to exist. The initial report, filed under category presumed lost, carried just 5 words under probable cause: lost at sea. No survivors. It was a verdict repeated countless times in the war's Pacific theater, but for those who had known the 7 men aboard, it wasn't closure. It was a question mark, one that would hang over their names for decades. At dawn on July 19, 1944, the U.S. Navy mobilized one of the largest search efforts of the Pacific Campaign. Catalina PBY flying boats swept low over cobalt waters, their searchlights cutting wide arcs as destroyers fanned out in grid patterns below. The area they needed to cover was staggering, over 200,000 square miles of ocean, much of it beyond radar range, scattered with hidden reefs, violent squalls, and nothing but water to the horizon. For the men in those search planes, it was like trying to find a single grain of sand in a desert. Day after day, they combed the sea. Crews strained their eyes for signs of wreckage, an oil slick, a floating wing, even a life raft. Twice spotters reported faint glints in the water, but they turned out to be nothing more than drifting debris. On the 5th day, a reconnaissance plane thought it saw a flare on the horizon, but when they circled back, there was nothing there. Each false lead chipped away at hope. Each mile of empty water made the truth harder to deny. Back home, telegrams began to arrive. Missing in action. 3 words that shattered families. In Kansas, Jim Mallory's wife, Clara, refused to believe it. She wrote him letters every day, leaving them on the kitchen table as if he might walk through the door at any moment. Paul Rizzo's parents in Brooklyn pinned a map of the Pacific on their wall, marking every possible crash site with red string. And in a small apartment in Los Angeles, Charles Ito's younger sister sat by the radio each night, listening for news that never came. Weeks passed. Fuel and manpower were diverted to other missions. The war marched on, and slowly, painfully, the search was scaled back. By early August, the official order was signed, search terminated, all personnel presumed lost. The Navy's report was cold and final, a single paragraph in a sea of wartime paperwork. But for the families, it was not an ending. It was a void. The Pacific had swallowed their sons, brothers, husbands, and friends without a trace. And with no wreckage, no answers, and no goodbyes, the legend of the Stardust Eagle was born. A ghost bomber lost to history, waiting somewhere beneath the waves. The telegrams arrived with cold precision, one by one, each bearing the same sterile language. We regret to inform you that your son, husband, or brother has been reported missing in action. No details, no explanation, just words that shattered lives. In a quiet Kansas farmhouse, Clara Mallory read hers over and over until the ink smudged beneath her tears. She refused to accept that her husband Jim was gone. Every evening she set 2 plates at the dinner table. Every night she left the porch light burning, convinced he'd walk through the door with that same easy smile. Weeks turned to months, and the plates grew dusty, but the light stayed on. In Brooklyn, Paul Rizzo's parents clung to their son's last letter, written 2 days before takeoff. "Don't worry about me," he'd joked. "This crew's invincible." His mother folded and unfolded that letter until the creases wore thin, reading it aloud as if repeating the words could bring him back. They'd raised money for a war bond drive in his name, but every victory parade, every flag-waving speech felt hollow without him there. In Los Angeles, the Ito family gathered nightly around a small altar adorned with their son Charles's photograph and a candle. His younger sister wrote in her diary about how she'd imagined him coming home, teaching her how to read maps, taking her for ice cream like he'd promised. Instead, she grew up with a ghost, a brother frozen in time, forever 24. Billy Harris's wife, May, received his final telegram on her wedding anniversary. "Can't wait to see you again," it read. She never remarried, never stopped calling herself Mrs. Harris. She kept his uniform pressed and hanging in the closet, and every Christmas she mailed a card addressed to him at the base, even though she knew it would never be answered. Across the country, the story repeated itself. Empty chairs at family tables, unopened birthday presents, children who would never know their fathers except through faded photographs and whispered stories. Official records listed the Stardust Eagle as missing, presumed lost, one of over 8,000 Allied aircraft unaccounted for in the Pacific. Just another number in a war that consumed men and machines by the thousands. But to the families left behind, it wasn't a statistic. It was a wound that never closed, an unanswered question that haunted generations. The Pacific is vast beyond comprehension, a restless, endless expanse that swallows history whole. Beneath its shimmering surface lies a graveyard unlike any other, thousands of ships, submarines, and aircraft scattered across the seafloor like forgotten bones. Some rest just a few miles from shore, others in trenches deeper than Mount Everest is tall. Their names and stories are lost to time, erased by the relentless churn of salt water and sand. Salt eats through aluminum and steel, turning once proud war machines into twisted skeletons. Coral creeps over fuselages, sealing cockpits beneath living tombs. Ocean currents drag wreckage for miles from where it first hit the water, scattering evidence until it becomes indistinguishable from the seafloor. Storms rage overhead, shifting sands and burying relics deeper still. Even when wreckage is found, it is often so transformed by decades underwater that identification becomes a puzzle. Serial numbers eroded, insignias long gone. The Pacific does not easily give up its secrets. Countless search expeditions over the decades have returned empty-handed. Sonar scans pick up anomalies, maybe a rock formation, maybe a wing, but the depths guard their truths fiercely. The families of the Stardust Eagle learned this painful lesson year after year. Every few years, a rumor would surface, a wreckage spotted off the Solomon Islands, a diver claiming to have seen a B-24 tail section half buried in coral. But each lead dissolved into disappointment, swallowed again by the deep. For 75 years, the Stardust Eagle remained one of the Pacific's many phantoms, its fate debated by historians and veterans alike. Some believed it had disintegrated on impact, sinking too deep for any search to reach. Others were certain it had drifted far from its last known coordinates, carried by currents into uncharted waters. The ocean, indifferent and immense, kept its silence. And yet, as technology advanced with sonar mapping, deep-sea drones, and satellite imaging, whispers began to circulate in the early 21st century. A shape too symmetrical to be natural. A metallic glint half buried in sand. Hope stirred once more in the hearts of those who had waited a lifetime. Perhaps, after decades of mystery, the Pacific was finally ready to speak. Perhaps the Stardust Eagle was not lost forever, just waiting, patiently, for someone to come looking. It was a clear morning in the spring of 2019 when the research vessel Endeavour slipped quietly into a remote stretch of the Pacific, hundreds of miles from the nearest port. Its crew, a joint expedition of marine archaeologists, sonar specialists, and naval historians, wasn't searching for a bomber. Their mission was to map a section of the ocean floor previously unexplored, part of a broader effort to chart forgotten World War II wrecks. For most of the crew, the Stardust Eagle was just a story, a ghost ship whispered about in veteran circles, a line in a dusty archive. None of them expected to find it. But on the fourth day of the expedition, as the sonar array swept a desolate stretch of seabed 17,000 feet below, an anomaly flickered across the monitor. At first it looked like a trick of the signal, a distorted shadow in the deep. Then the shape sharpened. A fuselage nearly 70 feet long, a wingspan stretching wide, and the unmistakable outline of a 4-engine aircraft. The room fell silent. The coordinates placed it hundreds of miles from the bomber's presumed flight path, far deeper than anyone had imagined. "Could be a Japanese transport," one of the technicians muttered. Another suggested it was nothing more than an oddly shaped rock formation. The Pacific had fooled them before, sonar ghosts that vanished on closer inspection. But Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the lead archaeologist, wasn't so sure. The proportions were too precise, the symmetry too deliberate. "That's a plane," she whispered, eyes fixed on the screen. "And a big one." For days they studied the anomaly from every angle, cross-referencing historical flight records and known crash sites. Each new scan only deepened the mystery. The object's size and configuration matched no known Japanese aircraft, but it did match a B-24. Hayes's heart raced as she read the mission logs from 1944. The Stardust Eagle, missing since July 18th, last seen flying over this very sector. It was still too early to celebrate. The ocean had a way of playing cruel tricks, and false hope was as common as barnacles on a wreck. Yet, as preparations began for a remote submersible dive, an unspoken electricity filled the ship. After 75 years, the Pacific might finally be ready to reveal one of its oldest secrets. 3 days later, the crew of the Endeavour gathered around a glowing bank of monitors as the ROV, a remote-operated submersible named Nereid, began its slow, silent descent into the abyss. The camera feed showed a world few humans had ever seen, a pitch-black void where sunlight could not reach, where pressure could crush steel like paper, and where the ghosts of history slept undisturbed. As Nereid dropped past 10,000 feet, the ocean grew darker still, a realm of cold and silence. Past 15,000, even marine life vanished, replaced by an eerie nothingness. And then, at 17,034 feet, the cameras caught a glint of metal. Gasps filled the control room. The seabed came into view, and resting upon it, draped in silt and coral, was the unmistakable silhouette of a B-24 bomber. Its wings were still attached, one propeller, frozen mid-spin, twisted and torn by the impact. The fuselage lay half buried in sand, its once bright aluminum skin now mottled and scarred by decades of saltwater decay. And yet, despite the passage of time, it was unmistakably whole, as if it had landed there yesterday. The camera panned slowly along the length of the wreck. The nose art, faded but still faintly visible, spelled out Stardust Eagle in ghostly letters. The glass of the cockpit had shattered long ago, but inside, the instrument panel remained eerily intact, its dials frozen at the moment the bomber vanished. Torn parachutes lay tangled in the rear gun bay. Ammunition belts hung limp from their feeds. It was as if the aircraft, and everything within it, had been locked in time, sealed in a watery tomb since 1944. A heavy silence fell over the control room. It wasn't triumph they felt, but reverence, the weight of history pressing down on them. For 75 years, families had waited for answers. For 75 years, the Pacific had kept its secret. And now, staring at the ghostly image on their screens, the truth was finally within reach. The Stardust Eagle had been found. It hadn't been shot down or captured. It hadn't disintegrated or drifted away. It had simply fallen and waited patiently in the dark for someone to come looking. And now, at last, someone had. When the ROV's floodlights swept through the shattered cockpit window, the room aboard the Endeavour fell silent again. What they saw wasn't just wreckage. It was a story, frozen in its final chapter. Captain Jim Mallory's seat was still upright, his hands resting on the control yoke as if he'd never stopped flying. A rusted flight helmet clung stubbornly to the seat beside him, Frank Dawson's, the co-pilot who'd once joked that nothing short of a bullet could bring them down. Behind them, the navigator's station was untouched, maps still spread across the table, pencil marks circling grid coordinates last charted in July 1944. Further back, the radio compartment looked eerily preserved. Harris's headset still hung from a hook above the console, its wires trailing into the dark. On the floor beneath it, a set of typed code sheets remained sealed in a waterproof pouch, the same instructions they'd likely been transmitting before their final message was cut short. Nearby, an ammunition crate sat half open, the bullets inside dull with corrosion, but perfectly arranged, untouched by human hands for 75 years. Then came the discovery that chilled even the most seasoned members of the expedition. As the camera passed over the midsection, the skeletal remains of a man, likely Paul Rizzo, the flight engineer, were slumped near the engine access panel. Further aft, in the gunner's compartment, 2 more skeletons were found still seated at their posts, their weapons trained on empty water. The positions told a haunting story. They hadn't tried to bail out. They hadn't reached for parachutes. They had stayed at their stations, even in their final moments. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the wreck. A cigarette case engraved with the initials CI, a rosary still looped around a skeletal wrist, a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth, their ink blurred but still legible. One note, found folded beneath a flight jacket, read simply, "See you soon." Save me a dance it was never sent. The realization hit hard. They hadn't escaped. There had been no desperate attempt to ditch the aircraft or abandon ship. Whatever happened that day, it happened too quickly, too violently, or too unexpectedly for anyone to react. The Stardust Eagle wasn't just a wreck. It was a tomb. And in that cold, silent chamber beneath the Pacific, 7 men had waited decades for someone to find them. Once the wreck's coordinates were secured, recovery efforts began with painstaking care. Each artifact was cataloged, each fragment photographed in situ before being carefully brought to the surface. The first breakthrough came from a small steel plate riveted inside the cockpit, the aircraft's identification tag, still faintly legible beneath decades of corrosion. It read, Consolidated B-24 J255, serial number 42-73214. The number confirmed what the crew had suspected all along. This was the Stardust Eagle. Dog tags followed. One by one, they were recovered from skeletal remains and loose debris. Mallory, J.R. Rizzo, P. Harris, W.E., names that had lived only on memorial plaques and faded photographs now held in the hands of living historians. A torn flight manual was found wedged beneath the navigator's seat, its final page scrawled with hastily written coordinates, and a single note, weather worsening. Adjusting course. It was the closest thing to a final log entry they would ever find. Uniform fragments, oxygen masks, and sidearms emerged from the silt, each item telling a small piece of the story. A warped pocket watch, stopped at 10:56, might have marked the moment the bomber went down. A signal flare pistol still loaded suggested they'd intended to call for help, but never got the chance. Even the fuel gauges were recovered and analyzed, revealing that the tanks were nearly empty when the bomber hit the water. Forensic experts and aviation historians spent months piecing together the evidence. The most likely scenario began to take shape. The Stardust Eagle had encountered a sudden Pacific storm that scrambled navigation and forced them off course. Disoriented and low on fuel, the crew may have descended through heavy cloud cover, believing they were still over land, only to strike the ocean at high speed. There was no evidence of enemy fire, no sign of sabotage or mechanical failure beyond what would be expected after decades underwater. And yet, questions lingered. Why hadn't they sent a distress call? Why had the engines been running on near empty if they'd known they were lost? And why had they gone so far off course? Some mysteries might never be solved. But one thing was certain. The discovery had rewritten the final chapter of the Stardust Eagle's story. It was no longer a ghost. It was a piece of living history, and for the families who had waited a lifetime, it was finally home. When the news broke, it rippled across the world like a long-awaited heartbeat. 75 years after the Stardust Eagle vanished, the United States Air Force held a press conference confirming the bomber's discovery and the recovery of remains from its crew. For many, the names meant little more than a footnote in history. But for the families, those who had waited in silence, who had kept photos on mantels and letters in drawers, the words meant everything. Closure, at last. Clara Mallory, now 99 and frail but still sharp as ever, wept quietly when she was handed her husband Jim's wedding ring, recovered from the cockpit. She had never remarried, insisting she was still Mrs. Mallory until the day she died. "I knew he'd come home," she whispered through tears, her trembling hands clutching the ring as if afraid it might disappear again. The daughter of radio operator Billy Harris, born 6 months after her father vanished, and now a grandmother herself, held his dog tags for the first time. "I never got to meet him," she said softly, "but now I can say goodbye." The remains of the crew were flown home under full military honors. Caskets draped in American flags were carried by solemn pallbearers as a 21-gun salute echoed across the tarmac. Crowds gathered to pay their respects, veterans saluting, children waving flags, families embracing one another in long, tearful silence. For decades, their names had been etched into memorial walls and printed on faded telegrams. Now they had faces, stories, and a final resting place. At Arlington National Cemetery, a joint memorial was held beneath a summer sky not unlike the one they'd flown into all those years ago. Descendants spoke of fathers they'd never met, brothers they'd barely remembered, and uncles who had been nothing more than stories told at the dinner table. When the last note of taps faded into the wind, a profound stillness settled over the crowd, not grief, but peace. The men of the Stardust Eagle were no longer lost. They were home, honored, remembered. The wait was over. In the end, the discovery of the Stardust Eagle was about more than solving a mystery. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the brutal reality of war, how, in the span of a single heartbeat, young men can vanish into the sky and become ghosts of history. It showed how even the bravest, the best trained, the most prepared can be humbled by nature's vast indifference. Out over the Pacific, courage wasn't always enough. Sometimes fate had the final word. The ocean itself is a paradox, a place of beauty and violence, serenity and death. During World War II, it was both a battlefield and a graveyard, claiming thousands of ships and aircraft, swallowing their stories whole. Yet in its depths, it also preserved them. The Stardust Eagle was more than wreckage. It was a time capsule, sealed beneath miles of water, holding not just metal and machinery, but the hopes and dreams of 7 men who believed they would return. Their maps still charted a course home. Their letters still spoke of love and plans for the future. Their seats remained filled as if they'd never left. For historians, the bomber offered a window into the past, a glimpse of what war looked like, not in grand battles or decisive victories, but in the quiet, forgotten losses that ripple outward through generations. For the families, it was proof that memory endures, even when evidence seems lost forever. And for all of us, it was a reminder that history doesn't stay buried. Sooner or later, the ocean gives back its secrets. The Stardust Eagle's discovery was the final chapter in a story that began on a humid July morning in 1944. But in many ways, it was also a beginning, a chance to remember, to honor, and to understand. The bomber that vanished into the clouds did not disappear into nothing. It remained, waiting patiently in the darkness, carrying with it the lives and dreams of the men who never came home. And now, at last, those dreams have surfaced, whispering one final message from the deep. We were here. We lived. We mattered. This video was intense, but this video on the right-hand side is even more insane.